Okay, I'm going to hit a few highlights from the three chapters that you read for this week. And I looped these three documents together because they're about the same length, and many of the concerns that we have in communicating either good news or bad news effectively, that tends to happen in these shorter documents. And so this becomes sort of a way to talk about the direct and indirect approach while kind of lumping these three things together. Now, your challenge is going to be reading these three chapters carefully and then being able to choose which one is appropriate for what situation. And I'm also not going over format here. So you need to get the format from those chapters, which again, it's easy to do because you read the chapter, the format's laid out there very clearly. So I want you to think about which one of these is going to be appropriate for the week's assignment. Choose that and then be able to defend your choice, referring back to Lennon. But a few highlights of what these have in common. First of all, the first question in any sort of workplace communication, but especially with these short documents, is whether or not the written message is the way to go at all. A set of instructions, a technical report, those longer documents, you have no choice. Cover letter, resume, you have no choice. But when you have a bit of information or news you have to convey in an organization, there are other options. You can walk down the hall, give somebody a phone call, hold a meeting. Now, for this week's writing assignment, it's a writing assignment, so you have to choose one of these three modes of communication. But to be honest, when you're dealing with a customer complaint, sometimes having a sales rep that they work with regularly, just go out and meet them, is the best way of dealing with those sorts of things. Now, again, you can't choose that as an option because this is a writing class. You have to write a response. So you have to choose memo, email, or letter for that. But it's worth keeping in mind that before you write anything, you should ask yourself, is writing the best way to go about it? Reasons to write: if the message is very important or complicated, you can lay it out more clearly just for yourself and also for your audience. If you outline it, lay it down on a piece of paper, you can look at it and see where it might be confusing, fill in any gaps, make sure all the information's there. It also lets the reader read the message more than once. So if they don't understand it the first time through, they can read it again. If you need to create a written record, so for example, employment issues, reprimanding somebody. In the case of a complaint, documenting the complaint just in case there are legal ramifications later on. Written records are used primarily for two things in the workplace: for things like performance evaluation for a project, a team, or an individual, and also for any legal issues that might arise down the road. Okay? Some of the advantages of written messages: first of all, they lessen the chance of misunderstanding because you are not going to be misread in the way you might be misheard. Or you're not going to think you said something you didn't say because you'll have that written record to look at. It gives the reader something concrete to look at again after the fact. So if they want to revisit your message for clarification, then they have that in hand. And it makes sure if there are multiple people getting the message that everybody gets the same message. Even in a meeting, when you give the same presentation, different people might hear things differently. Someone might space out at one point and not at another, or maybe your relationship with somebody just has them hearing things that you say differently. They like you, so they think you're brilliant. They don't like you, everything you say stinks. Sorry. So that's an extremely useful aspect of this. Everybody gets exactly the same message. Disadvantages: they create paper trails. So there may be situations in which you do not want a paper trail. Now, this is kind of getting at potential ethical issues, and I don't want to in any way imply that you use this as a way of avoiding keeping a record when a record might be needed down the road. But for example, if somebody, an employee, makes a mistake and you don't want to put anything in their permanent file because you think it's a matter, maybe it's a new person, a verbal suggestion or conversation will probably be enough to fix it, then you might want to just talk to that person instead of creating something that down the road could be read to indicate that there is a bigger problem than there actually was. So those are the sorts of situations, ethically speaking, in which it might be the best thing not to have that paper trail in place. Some people will get annoyed getting an email, a memo, or a letter if they know you could have just given them a phone call. Okay, so again, it goes back to you making that choice. Is a quick phone call the way to go with that? Do you need the information quickly? Is it not really anything that needs a great deal of massaging or thinking about for whatever reason? Then you might actually put your reader off by sending a message. They could potentially also make a situation public again, which is better dealt with than private. And this kind of goes back to that paper trails concern. You may have an issue with somebody that you just want dealt with. So, for example, maybe somebody is just behaving in an annoying way at work, not in a way that's inappropriate, that crosses boundaries in terms of harassment or anything like that, but just as being annoying. Maybe someone's just, popping by your office and chatting too much. Um, a written message could potentially make that very public, especially a memo. Memos tend to be copied not just to the person you send it to, but usually there's some other repository where those are kept. Emails, once they're on the server, they're on the server. And although we kind of assume most of the time our bosses aren't reading all of our emails, they're considered company property, so our bosses actually have access. And because of there's a Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, which means people in the public can request information. So if you and I have a heated exchange on our email, and someone in the public asks for all emails from people in this division, even for something completely unrelated, that dispute might become public. So you just want to be aware of that. Okay, an effective message, and that goes for all of these kind of shorter messages. Well organized, and part of that comes down to getting the format right. Part of it comes down to following the good news or the bad news, the direct or the indirect approach. Written in a reader-friendly style that gives prominence to the main idea. Reader-friendly, you text, and we'll look at a chapter when we get down to editing the technical report that talks about a reader-friendly writing style that basically is clear, easy to understand, uses the appropriate language, but simple language. Okay, so we'll look at that later on as well. And it satisfies your reader's informational needs. Concise does not mean short necessarily. You've got to make sure your message is as short as it can be, but while still delivering all the essential information, because a reader will get very frustrated if they have to follow up with you, if you've generated work with it for them by not including information that they need. Interpersonal considerations, as you write this, focus on the reader's perspective, not how you mean to say something, but how they might hear it. Okay? So, for example, if you are recommending or delivering mandatory training for everybody, and to you this is a good thing because the training is really going to help everybody, the reader might hear that as, well, you think I can't do my job, so you're making me get trained, or this is a big hassle, I don't need the training, why am I wasting my time? I mean, there are all sorts of ways that might be filtered that really might not occur to you because you know why you're communicating what you're communicating. You know the reasons behind it. Focus on the human connection. Make sure, this is one of the reasons in this type of relatively informal business writing, you use I and you when it's appropriate, especially you. I may not be appropriate if you're writing on behalf of like a division or something like that, but I and you are ways of making that one-on-one connection with your reader. Use plain English. Anticipate the reader's reaction as much as possible, and then decide on this direct or indirect plan. This is the good news message. Here is your direct plan. When you're just telling somebody something they're going to hear is either good or neutral news, in other words, they're not going to have a negative reaction, give them the main idea right away. There's a meeting at 10 o'clock to give out bonuses. People won't mind meeting for bonuses. First line should say, here's the meeting time. So the information is easily accessible. The only reason you violate that rule of getting the important information up top is when you're afraid of how that information might be received, and you might want to build up to it or massage it a little bit. Make sure the good news is clear, concise, and polite. The wrong phrasing could still put somebody off, even if you're just telling them something neutral. For example, a very kind of cool, formal tone can make people feel like they're being dictated to, even if you're telling them something completely neutral. Right? There will be a brief shutdown of computer systems tomorrow between 10 and 10:30. If the tone is abrupt, sharp, dismissive of their potential concerns, that could actually be a potential bad news. But let's say it's a very small inconvenience. It's just news. You could potentially put readers off. For example, if you say, unfortunately, the computers will be down, that one word, unfortunately, can influence how they receive that news. You're telling them it's a problem, if that makes sense. The sequence of ideas is really important in delivering any sort of message. So for good news, the good news comes first. Include all the necessary details, anything that helps the reader understand the message. Whatever news you give them will not benefit them if they don't have all the information they need to act on what you're telling them about. Okay, so again, a new bonus. If you there's a new bonus system in place, not giving everybody the details they need to access that could potentially make this, again, not bad news, but frustrating news, because they want this thing. It's a good thing, but they have to actually do follow-up work to find out how it works. Try to anticipate questions. This is that you attitude. We talked earlier about using you in the message itself, you and I in the message itself. The you attitude goes beyond that, actually thinking about what the reader might need to know. And we've talked about this throughout the course so far. What are the informational needs of your reader? Always include an action step, and this is usually at the end of any message. Here, the action step will tell readers how to take advantage of this news, and really, whenever possible, if there's a procedure they have to follow or something they have to do, make sure this makes it sound easy to do. That's done in part by making sure the information is there and is very clear, but also when you can, accessing this bonus system is easy. All you have to do is blah blah blah. Because again, if it seems too complicated or too difficult, you could potentially push yourself over the border of good news to bad news, because bad news does not have to be you're fired, pack your bags. Bad news can just be something that someone's going to receive negatively. And then a positive closing. Okay, emphasize what has or is going to be done, avoids mentioning anything that can't be done, any drawbacks or caveats. If there's something, for example, that maybe a certain employee category can't access certain types of bonuses, you kind of want that in the middle of the message. You want it to be clear so they know, but you don't want to highlight that, and you certainly don't want that mentioned again at the very end, because that's what people will take away from it. And even people who will get the bonuses may feel like the company is doing something dicey by not being fair or whatever. So keep the end positive. Keep the end positive. Good news memos should capture a reader's attention, satisfy their informational need, and build and maintain their goodwill. And this is that undercurrent of persuasion I've talked about a few times, that every message you convey, part of what's going on in the work in those messages is trying to reaffirm a positive work relationship with people. Bad news. Okay, bad news contains a message that a reader might consider disappointing or unfavorable, so it doesn't have to be terrible news. Okay, so for example, if I come in at 9 and suddenly there's going to be a weekly meeting at 8 o'clock, that's not bad news in the sense that my pet parakeet has died, or my Aunt Matilda is moving to California and I like her, or my Aunt Matilda from California is moving to Michigan and I don't like her. I mean, that's bad news. This is just news that I might not like to hear. Consider that bad news as you present it. The underlying purpose is to give this bad news and, again, maintain goodwill. It's just more difficult to do the latter when you're delivering bad news. And that's why these take more thought. A good news message, once you get a flow for how to organize things clearly, those are fairly easy to write. They don't take a whole lot of planning. Bad news messages, even when they're short messages like memos or letters or emails, they take some strategizing. You just have to think about what you're going to do. One of the key things is if you're giving somebody bad news saying you can't do something or something, be sincere and convey your concern for them. Let them know that you understand this is difficult. Okay? And no matter what, avoid any sort of personal rejection. So if somebody's made a request that you can't fulfill, make sure the rationale for that, the presentation of that, is objective. Okay? I mean, obviously, if there's an issue in which somebody, for example, needs to be reprimanded for something, well, that's going to include a certain amount of personal rejection, but how do you deal with that? Well, focus on next steps. Focus on the positive. Be constructive. Okay? Obviously, down the road, if there's a fourth or a fifth warning and you're looking at beginning more serious procedures, well, then the professionalism, gentleness of this is going to decline bit by bit. If I have a disruptive student, I'll pull them aside after class and say, listen, this is what you're doing here is kind of disrupting the class. I don't want to have to go through this whole formal process, so let's just fix it. If that student keeps being disruptive, step by step, that process becomes more formal. Okay, and my communications become firmer and harsher. Thankfully, I don't have disruptive student issues, but were I to, that's how the process works. Guidelines for bad news: use the you attitude. If possible, think about how the bad news might actually benefit the reader or at least meet their needs. So, for example, swapping out computer systems from Mac to PC or PC to Mac might be taken as bad news. If I've been working on the same type of computer at this job for 5 years, I'm not going to want to learn a new system. So that's bad news. But how's it going to benefit the reader? That's what you want to emphasize. Be tactful. Don't focus on issues with the reader, inadequacies, mistakes. If it's a rejection of a request, make it clear that you're rejecting the request, not that person. Take a problem-solving approach. Try to recommend next steps, especially in that action step part of a bad news message. Display confidence, though. Don't apologize. Explain. Okay? If you've made a mistake, that's one thing. Okay? If you've made a mistake and an apology is going to be required to smooth things over, that's something else. But don't apologize for putting an 8 o'clock meeting on the calendar when the meeting's necessary. Okay, because that tells readers that it's, first of all, bad news, and you don't want to emphasize that because they'll know it's bad news when they read there's an 8 o'clock meeting. It'll emphasize the negative aspect of the news. Okay, but it also makes it sound like you might have had a choice. You apologize for something, it means you've made a mistake or you've done something you know somebody hasn't liked. Usually you apologize when you've made a bad decision or a bad choice. Reply promptly. If you get a request from somebody and you can't do it, the inclination sometimes is to delay responding because it's not comfortable, it's not easy. The problem is if you delay the response, that delay becomes part of the problem too. Okay, so not only am I frustrated and unhappy with the news that you're giving me, but I'm also frustrated because I haven't heard back from you. This happens in employment situations a lot. Some hiring processes, some places are very slow. There's nothing more frustrating than getting a rejection letter 6 months after you've applied someplace. Giving bad news, first of all, open with a positive. Okay? This can serve as kind of a cushion. It softens a blow of the bad news. Okay? From that positive, then you lead into the thing that's going to be negative. One thing that's really important, though, is you still have to make sure your readers' informational needs are met and that they don't think they're getting good news, because that'll take make the blow of that bad news even harder. So, for example, in employment letters, oftentimes the response is, thank you for your application. We received so many very excellent, your skills are great, your blah, blah, blah. That's a way of building up to the negative. Now, the problem with that, and I'll use that as an example, there are some situations when a certain positive opening is used so much that it actually winds up being a negative opening. If you get a letter from an employer saying, thank you for your application, you know immediately that's a rejection. Okay? And if you are accepting somebody's application, don't write the letter that way, because people will assume it's a rejection, because that's what these letters tend to look like. Explain the circumstances that lead to the bad stuff. So if there's a meeting, why does it have to be 8 o'clock? What is important about this meeting? If you're not hiring somebody, a lot of times you can't go into detail unless somebody's a candidate, like one of the final candidates for the job. But at least that letter, again, typically they'll say something like, we had many, many, many qualified candidates. That's what's wrong. You might have been good, and oftentimes this is the case. You are very good, but another candidate was just a bit better or just fit what they were looking for a little bit better. Be straightforward and make sure the explanation is supported by facts. Then put in the statement of bad news. Try not to lead or end a paragraph with it if at all possible, because the thing that you read first in the paragraph, the thing you read last, these are the things that really stick with you. Okay? You do want to make sure that they get the bad news. Okay, so don't vary it so much that they don't know that they have to be at work the next day at 8 o'clock. But try to present it in such a way that you're not highlighting it and calling attention to the problem. If the bad news is clear from the rationale you've given, right? If you can leave out the statement of bad news, for example, I request training for PowerPoint software. I'm asking to go to a convention out in Las Vegas. Delta College has in-house training. So in their response to my request, they say, well, listen, we offer a full suite of office application training here at Delta College, free of charge, and I'd be happy to sign you up. That's it. Right? You don't have to say, and I'm not sending you to Las Vegas because I know what you're really going to get up to over there. Right? You're fine. You're giving them the news that they're going to get the training in-house. If they're a little bit dense about it and they come back and say, yeah, but I really want to go to Las Vegas, well, then you might have to be more explicit in the bad news. But there are situations where you can avoid it. Try it when you can to offer a constructive suggestion, an alternative option, next steps for them to follow up, things that they might consider doing differently in the future. Just try to make sure that substitute is appropriate. And sometimes it is only constructive advice for next time. that you can give. Finally, close in a way that's positive. Thank the reader, if at all possible, for something. That makes people feel appreciated. And you might also invite them. This is good for good or bad news, but especially in bad news, invite them to follow up with you. Find some way for them to follow up with you, because that, again, it'll make them feel like the door has not been slammed in their face, and it expresses your sincere concern for them. Situations when people might receive things as bad news, when you say no to them. They ask you to do something, but you said no. You start with that buffer again, saying that you've thought about it, you've looked into it, briefly explain why you couldn't do it, and then try to end on a positive note, again with a suggestion, right? Or an offer for further follow-up. Announcing change, and I'm not going to go into these links, but announcing change. People tend to be anxious about change. Okay, so here's the thing: if somebody comes along and tells me that from now on, well, I'll use a previous example. From now on, we're completely changing our computer systems. Even if the new computer systems are better, I'm going to feel anxiety about that. Okay, so that is good news, bad news. Again, read the stuff in the text carefully. I'm also going to share a Prezi presentation I put together without audio that hits a lot of these same things, but it's just an additional resource. This notion of when to use direct and indirect organizational styles in your writing is going to serve you well in any kind of communication you carry out. It is extremely important. You don't want to just deliver messages as they are without putting any thought into them, especially if your reader might have concerns with the message that you're delivering.